All right. Good evening and happy Thursday, the last day of the month. Uh, which is kind of hard to believe. My name's Beryl Cohen. I'm the Executive Director of NASW Indiana. I also run the NASW Tennessee chapter. And tonight we are talking about social work licensing in Indiana. Um, We're going to talk just a little bit about NASW, just so that you have an understanding of some of what we do. We'll talk about social work licensing, the process, how to get a license. We'll talk a little bit about licensing prep. We're going to try to cover a lot. Again, if you have a question, please raise your hand or put something in the chat. And between Steve and I, we will do our best to manage that and get you answers. Please, please, please remember that the information that is being provided is based on my understanding, our understanding of licensing in Indiana. NASW Indiana does not speak for the licensing board. We do not process your licensing applications. We we don't do those things. And so this is based on statute and 9+ years of sitting in on licensing board meetings and learning all there is to know about licensing. But we don't speak for the licensing board. This doesn't represent any decision from the licensing board. And so if we tell you that you will need to go talk to them or check with the board, please do that. Um, so we'll talk about all of these things and just a real quick overview for those of you who don't know who we are. NASW's been around since 1955. We were created with the merger of 7 different organizations. We have 55 chapters. Um, we Most of our work is around enhancing the professional growth and development of our members and of social workers, and to create and maintain professional standards for social workers, and to advance sound social policies. Really focusing on those things that impact the profession as well as the people that we serve. Um, the benefit of being a member, you can get information, news, advocacy at the state and federal level. We also have resources and job opportunities. So we'll have a career fair I believe towards the end of September. There'll be a national career fair through NASW National. We have training and education sessions that we do, including things like this. We have practice resources. And the biggest thing for me has always been the opportunities to network and build your professional network. And that is one of the really big things that you can do through NASW. So really and truly, this is all focused again on licensing in Indiana and why it's important. And the most important thing to remember about Indiana licensing and social work is that we have title protection in the state. So you need to have your LBSW, your LSW, or your LCSW to use the title social worker in the state. Um, there have been a lot of instances in the last month and a half or so of people being called social workers who don't have any education or background in social work, or people without a social work education calling themselves social workers. And we've been working really hard to help people understand that. But that is one of the most important reasons behind licensing at this point is around title protection. It's also that we're regulated the same way that any other profession is regulated, like nursing and medicine. It's a way to help make sure that social workers are competent to practice and are interacting in an ethical and safe manner. So there's some oversight. And there's a way for colleagues and the public to address concerns if a social worker steps outside the bounds of ethical and safe practice. So it really is around protection of the public and protection of the profession. Most of you probably don't remember, but back in the 80s and early 90s, anybody, anywhere, anytime could call themselves a social worker with a high school diploma or no diploma and no grad, nothing. And so we've come a long way. And that really is part of the piece around licensing. So in Indiana, we have a licensing board. It's the Behavioral Health and Human Services Licensing Board. Their job is to establish the rules and regulations of the profession. and set the standard for licensing based on legislation that's passed by the Indiana General Assembly. They issue the licenses for social workers who meet the professional standards and complete the application process. They also set continuing education requirements for renewals. They provide the oversight and a way for public and colleagues to seek help if there are concerns about care that's being provided. So if somebody has a complaint about a social worker who did something that they think is wrong, the licensing board, again, is the one who would hold the hearing about it following an investigation through the Attorney General's office. And there is a specific section within the Indiana Attorney General's office that specifically looks at licensing and licensing complaints. As I mentioned earlier, licensure is required to work. So we hear a lot that somebody is working under another person's license. That is not a thing in Indiana. That's not an allowable action. It might be in another state, but it's not allowable here. Once you've graduated, in order to work, you have to have your license or a temporary permit. That is the only option that you have. There are some exemptions that I'll explain in a few minutes, but you have to have a temporary permit or a license after graduation to work. So you can't call yourself a social worker. You can't use the term clinical social worker, any other set of words. You can't sign it. You can't take the job that says social worker unless you have the title and you have the license or the temporary permit. There have been some issues in the past around people saying that DCS is not accepting a temporary permit as a legal license. It is. It's just you haven't taken the test yet, but it still gives you the ability to work. So the exemptions, and these are for social work only. So if you're a student, intern, or trainee pursuing a course of study, and your services are performed under qualified supervision and are part of your education, then you can do it. And as long as it's acknowledged that you're an intern, student, or trainee. If you have a license in another state, you can work in Indiana for no more than, and this is now you guys are covering up my, I'm gonna move, whoops. Oh no, sorry. Hold on. My computer just went a little wacky. Give me 1 second. Come on. There we go. So you can work in Indiana with a license from another state for not more than 5 days in any 1 month or more than 15 days in any one calendar year, as long as you have a license in good standing in another state. This is not meant for ongoing therapy. It's meant for an emergency. So you typically work in Kentucky and Louisville. You typically see your clients in Louisville. Your client ends up in Indiana for some reason. You could see them in Indiana for these as long as you met these requirements. And then there are a few other exemptions that are available. There's also an exemption if you work under a contract for DCS. So this isn't that you work for an employer who has a contract with DCS. It is that you work for an employer who has a contract with DCS and you actually work under that contract. So if an employer says, well, I have a DCS contract, but that's not what you're going to be doing. If you don't have a license, you can't work in that position. So you have to be under contract with the Department of Child Services. The organization has to be accredited, and you have to be supervised by somebody who's licensed. And Julia, I believe, dropped the slides for this in the chat, and we will be posting this PowerPoint as well as the recording, and the PowerPoint will all be posted up on our website so that you can grab it if you can't get it out of the chat today. Um, Again, if you're providing services under a contract, the Department of Child Services, and you have a bachelor's degree in social work, um, and it meets these requirements, and you're employed in a position that DCS has specified doesn't require a bachelor level degree in social work or other human services field, then you don't need to be licensed either. I would encourage you all to think about if you're planning on working with your BSW for a number of years, no matter where you're planning on working, to get your licenses as soon as you can. It's a valuable tool that can help you, and there's no reason to not get it right after graduation. So, are there any questions? I did not see any pop up. Okay, I'm going to keep going. If you guys have questions, feel free to raise your hands or ask. Um, so licensing oversight in Indiana is done through the Behavioral Health and Human Services Licensing Board. It is a composite board. So our board in Indiana oversees social work, marriage and family therapy, mental health counselors, and addictions. There, as far as each section has two representatives, plus there's a psychiatrist and consumer on the board. And whoops. And there are more licensed social workers in the state of Indiana. We are the largest group of licensed mental health providers in the state. So there are more of us than there are of marriage and family therapists, mental health counselors, and addictions made up across the board. So, and Steve dropped the link for the licensing board in the chat. So we have three levels of licensing for social work. We have an LBSW, which is, again, anybody who has a bachelor level license, an LSW for anybody with a master's level, and then an LCSW, which is master's plus experience, which includes 3,000 hours of experience, which you cannot do in less than 2 years. That is one of their requirements. So pathways to licensing. And I know this may sound complicated, but it's really the steps are pretty simple. And if you go to the Behavioral Health and Human Services Licensing Board website, it does do a really good job they have a frequently asked questions page, they have checklists, they have all kinds of information. So for those of you who are getting ready to graduate or will be graduating, say, later in the summer or in the fall, you can start your application prior to graduation. You can start your application prior to graduation. You can complete it after graduation by submitting your conferred official transcripts, or you can submit it and complete the majority of your application prior to graduation by providing a letter from your social work program that states that you are in good standing and that you are in your last term of school. And if you pass it before you graduate, then once you've graduated, you just have to submit your official transcripts and you would have your license. You do need to make sure that you are submitting an official transcript that shows that your degree has been conferred. If it just says that you've completed your courses, but it doesn't say conferred degree, official transcripts, it will not count. Again, there is a temporary permit. It is good for 12 months or until you pass your test. For LBSW and LSW, there is no extension or renewal of that temporary permit. So if you get a temporary permit, please make sure that you don't wait 9 or 10 months before you test, because if for some reason you don't pass the test, you will not be able to get a second permit and you will not be able to work without a permit. So this is a graphic that we put together that kind of explains the difference between testing after graduation and testing before graduation. So again, if you're going to test after graduation, you complete your application online, complete your background check, make sure everything is in, submit your documents, submit your conferred transcripts. It will be reviewed by the board. And then once it's approved, you will have the option. You'll get an email from them saying you've been approved. At that point, if you requested a temporary permit, that permit will be available, and they will give you information on and a number to contact ASWB to sign up and get yourself registered for the test and do all the other steps. Because it can take 3 to 4 weeks for your deferred transcripts to show up, for the conferred piece to show up on your transcripts, there could be a delay before you can submit your final transcripts, which could delay you getting approved. If you want to test before graduation, you do all of the same steps of completing a background check. You upload everything. Instead of uploading your conferred transcripts, you have to get a letter of good standing from your social work program. You upload that. Again, it gets reviewed. And once it's approved, they will give you information to register with ASWB. You can take the test. You pass the test before you graduate, then you just would need to submit your final transcripts to get your license, to officially be awarded a license. Without the transcript, there is no license. So that's the piece that has to happen. If you start and test prior to graduation, it is likely that you would get your license potentially 3 to 4 weeks before anybody else would. If you decide to wait until after graduation to submit your application, you have to wait until you have your conferred transcripts. And then you have to wait for them to process the application before you're going to get permission to take the test. So I hope this makes sense. It's a little confusing, and it's a new step that got added in. I believe last year we added in the ability to test before graduation.
And Beryl, I want to clarify one thing you said because it might be confusing that we're flipping back and forth between if you want the test before or after graduation and the issue of the transcript. If you want to just do the regular process, start your application, get everything in, and all you're missing is your transcript, you should check with your school to get an idea of how quickly they process them. It might be the same day as graduation, probably not. It's sometime after that. But if you have everything in place, once you're notified, you have your conferred transcript, you send it in. If you apply for a temporary permit also, then as soon as that's approved, you'll be approved with a temporary and you can sit for the exam. Take the exam right away, you pass, you have a license. So it might not be that long. Or you can do the other path and then take the exam ahead of time. And then the only thing you're missing is that transcript. Again, you just have to wait for it to be conferred by your school, and it's up to them how long that takes. So you could check with your school to ask what that process is or when you could expect to have that available.
So if you take the exam either before or after graduation or for your LCSW and you don't pass the exam, ASWB has a rule that you have to wait 90 days before you can retest. And so that is not a board decision. That is not an Indiana only decision. That is an ASWB rule that they have. There is an appeals process where you can ask to take it before 90 days, but that is an ASWB decision. And it's important to think about the distinction between certain things that ASWB does, certain things our licensing board does. Everybody has a slightly different rule. Yes, Francine, you have to have a letter. So your school has to provide the letter of good standing, and that's basically what gets you into test before graduation and before you would have a conferred diploma or transcripts. So, and it is for the LBSW and LSW. And you will need to talk to your programs about this. They have gotten information about this, so it is up to them. And there should be somebody assigned within each social work program that is doing the letters. It's just a standard letter. Um, so when you think about what's needed for a social work license, so you have to complete an online application. You have to make sure you provide all the information. Please remember that when you sign, even if it's electronically signing this application, you are indicating that everything is true and accurate. So please just be careful how you answer the questions, and we'll go over a couple of questions that can sometimes trip people up along the way. You have to complete a criminal background check. So when you submit your application, um, they will, you'll get an email when you're supposed to go that you can go get your background check done. Um, so you want to make sure that when you fill out everything, when you set up your account through the state system, that you have an accurate email address, that you type it correctly, and that you check it regularly and check your spam folder every time you do, because sometimes some of this stuff will end up in a spam folder. Um, so your criminal background check goes through the state, Indiana State Police. If there's any positive responses, you will have to provide an affidavit explaining the positive response. Um, you might have to go in front of the board to explain things. It's not all the time. Sometimes you can do it um, by just providing an affidavit. And then again, once you have a conferred degree from an accredited CSWE program and you've passed the exam, those are the steps. Um, please remember that a lot of the delays that happen because people do not provide correct information, or they miss emails, or emails end up in spam boxes and so they don't answer, or somebody changes an email address. Um, if you've done a name change and your transcript isn't the same as the name that you use, which isn't, you need to, if those things can really make this a much harder process. If so, being consistent, making sure you answer everything, making sure you spell everything right. You all probably think I'm crazy when I say some of these things, but I'm always amazed at the number of people who misenter their emails when they sign up for things with us and then don't get the reminder for, for an event. So if they're mistyping an email for a registration, people are also misspelling emails for these systems, and it will create a problem. Um, everything that you need to do goes through, again, this website. Uh, you click on application instructions and it will take you to a page that you can then scroll down until you get to LBSW, LSW, or LCSW. And if you click on these, it will then take you to, this is the LSW application checklist. And so this is everything that you need to do, right? About the application fee, you can click on the criminal background check. It will explain to you what the what you need to do and how you do it and what the cost is for it. It explains to you about a positive response if you answer yes to certain things, what you need to do. It explains to you how to change your name and how to document that, how to take care of your official transcripts, your letter of good standing. Everything that you need is here. Um, my best piece of advice to all of you is when you think about doing these things, if you feel overwhelmed, take a deep breath and read it a couple of times, or print it out and read it, whatever you need to do. But almost everything you need to know is right here on the Behavioral Health Licensing Board under the application. So there is a slightly different checklist for each of the levels. There are no There are no supervision requirements for the LBSW or the LSW. There are supervision requirements for a clinical license, but you don't have to worry about showing and providing proof of supervision or anything else when you're applying for your LBSW or your LSW. Uh, when you are ready to apply, if you don't already have an account through the state, you will need to go in and fill out an application and create an account to process your licensing applications. That is also the same way that you will do your renewals every 2 years. It's how you can track your application. It's how you can submit additional documents. So your transcripts can get submitted this way. So please make sure that you keep track of your username and password. If you have any problems with this system of the application system, not a question about the how I get my license, but you can't log in, you forgot your password, you don't, there is a place on the PLA website where you can actually click for help through Access Indiana, which is the folks who take care of this, and they can answer those questions. Do Please do not call any of the licensing boards and ask them for help on your username or password because that's not, they don't do that. Access Indiana takes care of that piece. So one of the pieces that that tends to, I don't like using the word trip. I did use it before, trip people up. But I think one of the places where people get stuck sometimes is in this section where there's a bunch of questions you need to answer, right? And so if you've had any kind of license, right? The question is, has disciplinary action ever been taken regarding any license, certification, or registration? So if it has happened, you need to say yes, right? If you've ever been denied a license, you need to say yes. And then this piece where the big green arrow is. So, except for minor violations of traffic laws resulting in fines and arrests or convictions that have been expunged by a court, the question is, have you ever been arrested? Now, the next week's, then it goes on. Have you ever been convicted? Have you ever, right? All these other things. But if at some point you were arrested and it hasn't been expunged from your record, even if nothing else happened, you need to say yes. And I am not trying to accuse any of you of anything, but this is where if you say no and you had been arrested, say when you were 19 and did something you shouldn't have done, and you never did anything wrong again, if you say no, that never happened, you have now lied on an official document that you were signing and saying is accurate and true. So please make sure you read all of these carefully and you answer them correctly, um, because this is where a lot of people end up having to either provide that affidavit or potentially go in and meet with the board in person and talk about it and explain what happened. And those are public and they are streamed on the internet. So I would encourage you just to make sure that you read it correctly. Are there any, no questions? So you complete your
Beryl,
application.
before you
Yes.
leave there, I just thought I would help clarify for people to understand that the background check for your license is a federal national deeper dive than you might be used to if you've gotten the simple go on the Indiana website, get a back that comes back immediately. This is different. This goes across everything. And that's why Beryl's saying if you've had ever any kind of arrest or something on your background that you need to disclose it. It doesn't mean you can't get a license. I think people imagine like, oh my gosh, if I, as she said, the example is I was 19, I was at a party, got busted, I didn't do anything, it didn't happen. My attorney said, don't worry about it. Oh my God, now I'll never get my license. It doesn't mean that. It does mean if you say no, because your attorney said don't worry about it, but you were arrested, that means you're going to have to explain why you gave wrong information on your application. Why did you lie? Were you trying to misrepresent it? So you have to be honest. Social workers are supposed to be honest. So, and it also means if you you're not sure you were arrested or not. I've heard some people say, well, I wasn't arrested, but there's a record of it. And so you technically were arrested. Maybe it wasn't like you see on TV, but you have an arrest on your record. So you have to say yes and just put it in an affidavit and explain it. And many times those don't require coming in before the board based on your explanation or when it happened or what it was. That may be good enough just to disclose that something like that happened. Or maybe you got fired from a job. There's another question about that. It doesn't mean you can't get another one. It just means I'm being honest about this is what happened. So I hope that helps you understand what that's about.
And and I will add in because I've heard this, I don't know how many times when I've sat in and listened to the board meetings, which is that, well, it didn't show up on the last background check I did or on the DCS background check. It won't, but it might show up on this. So again, I'm not saying that any of you have done anything wrong in your life. So that is not the point. If you can avoid the stress of having them say you lied on this form and we need an explanation. Um, and and if something shows up and you refuse to talk about it or refuse to submit an affidavit, then you will end up having to talk to the board. Um, so
Well, and Beryl, another piece about that will be is if you get a notice back, if you submit this and you say no, but there was something on your record, your instinct will be to call the PLA and say, what's on there? And you should be prepared for them to say, we can't disclose that. That's private information. You can go get your own record, and you should look at it because it is your responsibility as an applicant to provide all of the information. So the staff is not going to tell you what you need to know. You should know it. So you have to keep that in mind. You might be freaking out, a little anxious about it, and like, I don't know what's on there, or it might have been a long time ago, but you have to investigate it. And you can. It's your record. So you need to access it, look at it, find out what it was, and then submit that information. But the staff are not going to be able to tell you.
and and please don't get mad at them for that. That is a PLA rule. That is not a behavioral health
It's
and
a
human
privacy
services.
rule. It's a
Yeah.
law about not disclosing things that you can't disclose. Yeah.
So, and
So you're right.
that's a PLA decision, not necessarily our board's decision.
Right.
It's a rule that they have. Um, okay, so again, your current transcripts, the completed criminal history check, $50 fee. Your temporary permit for an LSW and LBSW is good for 12 months or until you pass the test. You only get one permit, it's $25. There is a place on the application where you can, I believe it's a box you can check that says, I'm requesting a temporary permit. If you forget to do it or you don't think you're going to need it, but then you realize you do need it down the road, you can, you submit everything, they approve it, and then you realize I should have asked for a temporary permit. You can go back in through the portal and request a temporary permit. And as long as your application has been approved, you will get that temporary permit. But there's only one and it's only good for 12 months.
And actually, you have to create your initial application, and then you have to go back and add the temporary permit. That's the process.
Oh, they changed it. Okay, thank you.
So you do have to go back in and do it. And then because it has to be established, and then you can say, oh, I want that temporary permit as well to pay the additional fee. But you can do that anytime.
And you can also go down to the government center if you want to go in person and do it. They will only accept, they take checks and cash. They don't take credit cards.
Correct.
Correct. Um, if you have a job that doesn't require an LSW, I'm reading the chat. What is the, doesn't require an LSW, don't need to worry about the temporary permit. If it's a social work job, even if they don't require an LSW, you may need an LSW and you may need a temporary permit. We'll get to that in a minute. Lindsay, if I don't answer it, if we don't answer that, ask again and we'll clarify. But I think we'll get to that piece. Um, so in order to get your license, you have to pass the exam. The testing is done through the Association of Social Work Boards. You have to have your application approved before you can apply, before you can sit for the test. ASWB has a bunch of information on their website. You really need to go through it and make sure that you understand what you're doing and what the steps are. Once you've registered with ASWB, then you'll be able to schedule your test, and the testing is all done at Pearson VUE. You can test at any Pearson VUE site anywhere. So if you are in Richmond and the testing site in Dayton is closer to you than anything in Indiana or has a better date than any of the sites in Indiana, you can go there. It doesn't matter what state you take the test in. Um, And in fact, I know of a few people who have actually gone out of state, stayed in a hotel for a couple of days to get themselves into wherever they need to be to go in and take the test and do the test. So if there's better times, better dates available at a site that is not in Indiana, you can do it. Just make sure that all of the information is correct and they know where to send your test results. Um, there is going to be a change in the exams as of August 3rd. I put the link in. If you go to the ASWB website, which is aswb.org, they have a section solely on the exams. I am not going to try and even explain this. It's all on their website. If you have questions, you need to go look and read through it and understand. I've heard people say that the change is a good thing. I've heard people say the change is a bad thing. I You'll have to make up your own mind about, do you want to try and do it fast before August 3rd? Do you not? Does it matter? I don't know. Um, we do have reciprocity in the state. So if you're moving here from another state, or if you have a license in another state and you meet our requirements, you can apply for a reciprocity license. If you get a license in Illinois, or there's a few other states that are currently not requiring a test to get the LSW or the clinical license, you will be required to take the test in Indiana because that is what our statute currently says. So if you get a license in Ohio, and you've passed the test, you can bring it to Indiana and you can submit your application. It's the same application. You just check the box saying that it's a reciprocity application, and then you'd have to show proof of that you passed the test and other things. But it's all basically the same steps and the same expectations. So again, you have to have a license or a temporary permit to call yourself a social worker or to work in a social work position and to work with clients. There is a 90-day waiting period that you would need to talk to ASWB about if you want to get it waived. You'd also have to submit an application or a request to our board. I don't know that our board has ever denied somebody the request to not have to wait 90 days, but it is also it's mainly up to ASWB. If you need ADA accommodations, you have to request them when you register through the ASWB website. Do not, please, do not show up day of your test and say, oh, I need an ADA accommodation. I need my own room because of whatever the reason is. They will not likely be able to accommodate you. You have to make that request when you're registering with ASWB and when you actually go and set up your time at Pearson VUE. Please make sure that you ask for that accommodation. And you will need to provide paperwork and whatever other requirements they have for the ADA accommodations, but they do make accommodations and they are required to do it. So again, here is all the information about where you can find everything. Um, I routinely get phone calls from people who want me to tell them what the steps are for to get a license, and I will say to you and to everybody else, which is you need to go and you need to look through the website. If something doesn't make sense, then look at the FAQ section. You can call, and if we're able to provide an answer, we will. But again, we don't speak for the board, and there are certain things that only the board can answer. We cannot answer. But their frequently asked questions section is getting better and better all the time. Um, and you should be able to find almost every answer that you need on there, like on the website. Um, so there have been questions, and I think, Lindsay, this might answer your question. I'm not 100% sure, but uh, there have been questions about private practice, not private practice, 1099, employee, what's the difference? So in Indiana statute, it is very clear that the only people who can work independently in a private practice by themselves are people with a clinical license, which for social work would be somebody with an LCSW. If you do not have an LCSW, you cannot be in private practice. You cannot hang out a shingle and work by yourself. Can't. If you have an LSW or an LBSW, you have to be supervised by someone with a higher license. And if you have an LSW and you're working towards your clinical, your LCSW, your supervision has to be provided by somebody with an LCSW in Indiana. And they have to provide 4 hours of supervision each month to you. That can be separate from your day-to-day work supervisor. That's perfectly fine, but that supervision has to be through an LCSW. And if you are an LBSW or an LSW, you have to be employed and supervised, and you may not work as a 1099 contractor if you're providing therapy or other services, because by definition and the Fair Labor Standards Act, a contractor is independent. It is not employment, and you are not allowed to work as a contractor. If somebody wants to hire you as an LBSW or an LSW to write grants and not talk to people and not do some of that may be legal, but the actual therapy, that case management, those things you have to be an employee. And if you are working as a 1099 contractor, you are working outside the scope of practice, which is working illegally, and you could have somebody file a complaint. Are there questions? I know this is a really touchy area. Um,
Beryl, I would also add, I think that people are at risk if you're an MSW graduate, you get your working for your LSW, you get that all in place, and you are looking for work, you are approached by a private practice that says, come here, but I only pay by 1099, and you accept that, then you're at risk for those hours of supervised work not counting because, in fact, as Beryl's saying, you're practicing outside of the scope because you're doing independent work, which you're not eligible to do as a social worker. So you should ask questions and make sure that you understand that you're looking for employment where you can get supervision so that you can count those hours and not be outside of the scope of your practice. So if an employer, and I'll put that in air quotes, an employer says, that's how I do it, you should ask a lot of questions because that's putting you at risk. And it's your responsibility to know that.
and along those lines, if and I've had people tell me this. I've had people call and say, well, somebody offered me a job and said they don't care if I have a license or not. Well, your employers don't care if you have a license or not, mostly, because they're not the ones who would get in trouble. You are the one that would get in trouble for working without a license. You would be the one who would end up in front of the licensing board trying to explain why you were working without a license when it's very clear in statute that Unless you're in an exempt, one of those very limited exemptions, you cannot work without a license um, or a temporary permit. Um, and this is not this whole issue of 1099 versus employee, and this is not just an Indiana thing. This happens in lots of states where that time doesn't count towards your clinical hours. And there are people who have done, a year, 16, 18 months of work as a 1099, and then finally get to their 24 months and their hours and time, and they go in front of the board, and the board says none of that counts. So please just make sure that you are clear about what you're doing and how you're doing it, and don't get yourself to the point where you're working outside the scope of practice, which is against the law in the state. Um, yes, sorry, I cannot. I have my chat is tiny, tiny. So yes, Carissa, we can talk about that in a few minutes. I think that's it. These are just reminders. So let me just do one other quick piece on licensing prep, and then I'll stop sharing and we can answer some of these other questions. Does that work, Steve? Because some of
Yes.
them you know the answers to better than I do. So we do have a couple of licensing prep options for you. There's a group of NASW chapters who have gotten together to schedule a licensing prep course every month, sometimes twice in a month between now and the end of August. Um, they are all this, it's the cost is the same, the process is the same. It's with Don Apgar, who has been doing this for a long time. It's a 1 day training. You get the training plus you get access to her study guide website, which is an amazing resource of with all kinds of information where you can connect all kinds of things, and you can connect with Dawn too. Um, and it's up on our website, so if you're trying to find it, you can always link back from our website. I can't promise it's the red picture, it's the red frame, but we have the information. And then we also have one other one that we can recommend, which is Passive Pro, which is 100% virtual, all self-led. You decide when you're going to do it. You have 5 1-hour videos. You have access to them for 90 days. And they have been pretty successful. There are also a ton of other options out there. My only advice to anybody who's going to do a licensing prep and going to spend the money on a licensing prep course is to do one that's been created and written by a social worker. There are psychologists and other folks who do these and just talk about regular standardized tests. They probably are useful. I would encourage you to make sure that you find something that is created by a social worker. Um, you can also check with your university, your alumni programs, because a lot of them have licensing prep resources. Um, and just be careful, just like you would with anything that you might get online, because there are scams out there, and I just be careful with what you do and who you talk to. Um, so again, this will all be up on our website. I'll ask Julia to send it out if tomorrow morning to you all, a copy of the PowerPoint, a PDF of the PowerPoint, so you have it. Uh, and I think that's all I have. Oh, and the compact is still pending, and there will probably not be compact licenses before early 2027 at this point. So, um, and you can find more information about the compact. And no, Indiana has not passed the compact, and we won't have the opportunity until January when the session starts again. So, um, I am going to stop sharing and See if you all have other questions for us. I know there was one in the chat which just disappeared. Um, so can we explain the specific steps to follow to be eligible for the LCSW exam? Um, so you have to be working, you have to be working in a supervised position as an employee, and you have to be receiving supervision, 4 hours a month of supervision from somebody with an LCSW in Indiana. And the question of what type of work counts, Steve, can you provide information on that, please?
Well, I would suggest going to the website to learn information about that because it'll link you to what the scope of practice says a clinical license would do. So it would be clinical work that would count toward that because it's a clinical license. So that would be therapy and all the things that go along with doing that kind of work. So it would, of course, include it's going to be your client hours, but there's other hours that you're putting in for um, some of the prep work, the getting information. That's why it's considered like 30 hours a week. It suggests 30 hours a week, 3,000 hours over a 2 year period. And we can also note that it does, that some people do take longer than the 2 years because they are working part-time and that's allowable. It just may take you longer. And the thing that we should put out here while we're talking about this for anybody that would be gathering hours, supervision hours, and employment work hours toward that clinical license is to keep track of it. Make sure that you're keeping track, that your supervisor's keeping track, that your employer's keeping track. If you change supervisors, they leave, get them to fill out a form before they leave so you have it. You have that portion documented. Or if you change jobs, get your hours documented by that supervisor and hang on to that form so that you have it already in place before you decide you're going to apply so that it's you avoid that possibility of not finding that person again or that you don't know where they are, et cetera. So just remember, go ahead and collect those hours as you go along. And if you're keeping track, that makes it easier as well.
Yeah. So this, what's up on the screen. So it's the application instructions under the Behavioral Health and Human Services Licensing Board, right? Application instructions, scroll down to the clinical social work, and it lists the form you need to fill out around your clinical coursework. So if you did a macro level master's degree and didn't take clinical courses, you will need to take those clinical courses if you want to get your LCSW. As long as you took those clinical courses, you'll have to fill this out. And then you can click on any of these and it will open up the form that your supervisor will need to fill out. And it's really important that you all look at these and look at what information are you going to have to provide to verify your supervision? What information needs to be provided to verify your experience? Make sure that you can answer those questions when you take the job or you hook up with a supervisor. Don't wait, as Steve said, until you're ready to submit your application to realize that you used the wrong person or you don't know. Also, please, I know this has come up a lot where you may put that you started working on March 15th of 2025 and you worked at this place until December 31st of 2025. But the employer may say that you didn't start until March 18th because that was the Monday or whatever it was. So if those dates and times don't match, it creates a problem with your application and it takes more work, which could delay the processing of your applications. So please just make sure that you actually go through this. And it's something that we encourage anybody who's going to be providing supervision to somebody who's working towards their LCSW, as well as anybody who wants to get their LCSW, is to go in and look through this. You don't have to do it before you get your LSW, but if you want to do it, make sure that you know what you need to collect and make sure that you're collecting it in a way that you can answer the questions and verify everything so that when it comes time to submit that application, you're ready to do it and you're not trying to answer a bunch of extra questions. Are there other questions, comments?
There was a previous question about if it's not a social work job or it doesn't require an LSW, do you need to worry about a license? And I don't, maybe Lindsay could explain what kind of job it is. Is it like a retail job or a factory job? What kind of job is it that would not require you to have a license if it's social work? I don't.
Can you unmute Lindsay and explain what you're looking at? Because that there are jobs that don't require a license, but there's also the interpretation by, was it the Attorney General's office like 10 years ago or 12 years ago that said that if you're working in an agency that provides services, even if you don't provide the services, that you have to have a license.
Well,
Um,
and I think, in my view, if you have worked for your MSW or your BSW and you are ready to go into the professional world, the next step is to get your license. So even if a job would say, "Oh, don't worry about that," as an individual, I would be very interested in getting my license and I would do it right away because I would want to take advantage of taking that exam as quickly as possible after graduation so it's fresh in my head. I pass it, majority do when they follow that path, and then I would maintain my license. I do that because it's an individual thing, it's my responsibility, it's protection for me, it's protection for the public. So, so I think if somebody were to say, "Oh, don't worry about a license," I would ask a lot of questions.
Other questions? Okay. Because that's it for the presentation. So I am going to hold on a second. I'm gonna, oh, if I could remember, there we go. All right. So I'm going to stop the recording, and that way, if somebody has a question and you don't want to ask it and be recorded, I will stop the recording. Thank you all. And again, all this stuff will be posted on the website.